Well, I wish you could have heard the conversation at Preacher's Club last week. That's what I call my Tuesday morning coffee with a few of the other pastors in town. We get together to talk about what we will be preaching on the following Sunday, and last week we were talking about what we would preach on Easter Sunday. There seem to be two schools of thought on this subject. One is that you should preach the very best sermon you have in you, because Easter Sunday is when everybody comes to church. And if you preach a really good sermon, they may decide to come back the next week and hear you again. Some of the others in my group said that's not true at all. People don't come to church on Easter Sunday because of the preaching. They just come because it's the Easter Sunday thing to do. You could read out of the phone book as far as that goes. Wouldn't make any difference. So I've spent some time in the last few days trying to make up my mind. Which will I do today? Preach the best sermon I have in me, or simply read out of the Richmond telephone book? It's a big decision. In the end, I decided to just do the very best job I could and let the sermon fall wherever it will on that broad spectrum between phone book and phenomenal. You decide. Part of the problem, of course, is that on Easter Sunday you already know what the preacher is going to say. At some point in the sermon he will say, "Christ is risen." But by the time he says it, you've already heard it or sung it a half dozen times. It's old news by then. Frankly, it was old news before you got out of bed this morning, old news before you were born. This is 2,000-year-old news. And I don't care how good a preacher you are, it's hard to make it fresh. I was thinking about how it would be if just before I came to church this morning, I learned that a cure for cancer had been discovered. Can you imagine if I was standing there at the door getting ready to go out and I heard on the news that someone had developed a drug that would safely and effectively cure cancer? Not only cure those people who have it presently, but keep others from getting it, so that by the year 2015, cancer would be a thing of the past. Imagine how I would come to church, running down Monument Avenue with my coattails flying, running in through the front door, getting to the pulpit to announce to you, "I've got good news, friends. We found a cure for cancer." Some of you may remember April 12th, 1955, when a cure for polio was announced. Until that day, polio had been the most frightening disease of the post-World War II era. It was a plague that swept across the country every summer, claiming the lives of thousands of people, most of them children, and leaving tens of thousands more crippled. One reporter claimed that apart from the atomic bomb, America's greatest fear in those days was polio. But then came the news that after 7 years of tireless research, Dr. Jonas Salk had developed a vaccine that was declared to be safe and effective. A cure had been found. Paul Offit writes, "By the time the announcement was over, church bells were ringing across the country. Factories were observing moments of silence. Synagogues and churches were holding prayer meetings, and parents and teachers were weeping. It was as if a war had ended." So imagine the reaction if I could tell you this morning that a cure for cancer had been found. Cancer, a disease that kills and cripples millions more people every year than polio ever did. That would be good news, wouldn't it? That would have an impact. We wouldn't be able to contain ourselves. Becky Payne would start playing the Hallelujah chorus, even if it wasn't listed in the bulletin. The choir behind me would erupt in song, singing along with her. Someone would go out there and ring the church bell in the courtyard, and we would go out onto Monument Avenue looking for some poor jogger who hadn't heard the news yet, so we could grab her by the shoulders, look her in the eye, and say, "I've got good news. We've found a cure for cancer." Historian William O'Neill says that when the cure for polio was announced, April 12th almost became a national holiday. In the years that followed, people observed moments of silence, rang bells, honked horns, fired salutes, blew factory whistles, took the rest of the day off, closed schools, went home early, drank toasts, hugged children, attended church, smiled at strangers, forgave enemies. But they don't do that anymore, do they? April 12th did not become a national holiday. And if I stood up this morning to announce that a cure for polio had been discovered, some of you who remembered that day would smile and nod. Others would look confused, wondering what I was talking about. Still others would simply yawn and stretch. It's old news. It happened 57 years ago. How much more when the news is nearly 2,000 years old? And so we adjust our expectations. We don't come to church to hear the news. We come to observe a religious holiday. We put on our nicest clothes. We squeeze into a pew along with several others. We breathe in the aroma of Easter lilies. We sing, "Christ the Lord is risen today." We hear a sermon on the resurrection. But when the last hymn has been sung and the benediction pronounced, we may stroll out onto Monument Avenue. We may join the others who have gathered for Easter on parade. We may smile at the dogs wearing bunny ears out there. May nod at the people sitting on their front porches. We may even say to a complete stranger, "Happy Easter." But we will probably not grab anybody by the shoulders, look into their eyes and say, "Have you heard? Have you heard the good news? Christ is risen." It is good news, but it's old news. Doesn't have the impact it once had. But I've been thinking about resurrection in the past few days, just as you might expect. And here's what I've been thinking: that resurrection is even more newsworthy than a cure for cancer. A cure for cancer might keep some people from dying or keep them from dying sooner than they should, but resurrection is a cure for death itself, of which cancer and polio and every other disease is only a symptom. Think about it. The resurrection of Jesus wasn't good news only because Jesus, who died, was alive again, but because death itself had been defeated. A cure had been discovered. And the news spread everywhere. It has come to us across the miles and through the years. And it is such good news that even today, nearly 2,000 years later, we celebrate the resurrection. Because here's the truth. You may not have lost anybody to cancer. You may not know anybody who had polio as a child. But every one of us knows somebody who has died. Every one of us in this room has lost someone to death. And for some of us on this Easter morning, those losses are fresh and raw. It's to you especially that I want to say, listen, I've got good news. We've found a cure for death. During the season of Lent, I've been talking about the God who makes promises. But today I want to talk about the God who keeps promises. It seems clear that in the resurrection of Jesus, the writers of the New Testament found the fulfillment of a promise made long before, that God would not let His Holy One see corruption. But when I look back over those promises God has made in history, it seems clear that God doesn't want anybody to see corruption, doesn't want His world to see it. In the promises He makes and keeps, God seems to be working toward the redemption of all creation. You remember that in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, He looked on what He had made and said it was good. And when He made humankind in His image, both male and female, He called them very good. But it seems that humankind has been bent on wrecking God's good creation ever since. And here's the problem. God made us free. He gave us the freedom to choose for Him or against Him. If He hadn't, He could have put on the best puppet show nobody has ever seen. He could have danced us across the stage of history and made us do whatever He wanted us to do. But instead, He made us free. And from the very beginning, we have used our freedom to do not what He wanted, but what we wanted. And yet, He has never given up on us. When Adam and Eve did what He told them not to do, He could have given up on them. Could have given them the death sentence, but He didn't. He gave them a life sentence. He put them outside the Garden of Eden and urged them to make a life for themselves. It wasn't what He had dreamed in the beginning, but under the circumstances, it was something. They did the best they could, Adam earning his living by the sweat of his brow, Eve laboring painfully to bring children into the world. But their children seemed to have the same disobedient spirit they did. Cain killed his brother Abel and roamed the earth as a fugitive. Adam and Eve's other children fared a little better, but only a little. A few generations into the project, God looked on what He had made and shook His head with sorrow. It seemed that evil was all these people ever thought about. With a heavy heart, He decided to purge the world and start over again with Noah, a good man who might give rise to a whole new kind of humanity. But it wasn't what He had dreamed for His creation. And in the end, He came to Noah promising, never again. You might hope that the story would get better from there, but it doesn't. Turns out that Noah's descendants were no better than anybody else. Soon they were trying to build a tower with its top in the heavens so that they could climb up there, drag God off His throne, and sit there instead of Him. In a preemptive move, God mixed up their language and scattered them to the ends of the earth, and called one man, Abraham, to be the father of a family that among all the families on earth would be uniquely his. He made a promise to Abram that if he would only love him and trust him, God would give him descendants like the sands of the sea, like the stars of the sky. Abram did, and God kept His promise. Generations later, He came to the descendants of Abraham in the desert and said, listen, if you will be my people, I will be your God. It was a promise. But while God kept His part of the covenant, the people did not keep theirs. Eventually, God left them to themselves, let the Babylonians conquer them and carry them off into exile. It may have been the best thing that could have happened for them, because in all that time and in the years that followed, they wondered what had gone wrong and what they could do to make things right. So when John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, telling them to repent and be baptized as a way of getting ready for the one who was to come, they did it. All of Jerusalem and Judea came down to the Jordan to be baptized by John. Jesus came. And when He came up out of the water, the heavens were torn apart and a dove fluttered down, and the voice of God thundered, "You are my Son, the beloved." Again, not everybody believed it. Some people used their human freedom to ignore Jesus, to turn against Him, to arrest Him and try Him and crucify Him. That could have been the end of it right there. God could have simply washed His hands as Pilate did and said, enough of these people. They deserve whatever they get. But God wouldn't give up and didn't give up. And early in the morning, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, He raised Jesus from the dead and said, now, I'm throwing the doors open to everybody and not just the children of Abraham. You don't have to believe in my Son, but if you do, I will give you the gift of everlasting life. I promise. We've been living on that promise ever since, haven't we? We believe that in Jesus we have discovered a cure for death, that He really is, as He said to Martha, the resurrection and the life, and that whoever believes in Him, even if that one should die, will live again. We've been living on that promise, but we've seen far too many people die. And so far, we haven't seen anybody come back from the dead. We need to know that God is not only a God who makes promises, but a God who keeps them. I believe that He is. And here is the evidence that I would offer. That God could have annihilated us long ago, but He didn't. He seems intent not on destroying His creation, but on saving it. Time and time again, when we have used our human freedom to twist and pull down God's good intentions for what He has made, He has built it up again. And the Apostle Paul would say He is building toward something. In Romans 8, he says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. This is Paul, who had encountered the risen Lord on the road to Damascus, who believed in the resurrection with all his heart, who knew that it was still ahead for him, who said there is something more than that coming down the road. He said the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know, he said, that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Can you hear it? Paul says something wonderful is waiting just around the next bend in the road. It's coming. We're moving in that direction, and one of these days we will see it. Until then, we wait for it with patience. One of these days, God is going to use His divine freedom to redeem all of creation. I talked with someone not long ago who had lost a beloved pet, who wanted to know if I believed that all dogs go to heaven. And I think I surprised him by saying, yes, I do. All good dogs anyway. And I pointed to this passage in Romans 8 as proof. I said, look what Paul says. He says, one of these days, the creation itself, everything God has created, will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Not only dogs, but cats, birds, elephants, ostriches, beavers, antelopes, pine trees, poppies, Easter lilies, lilacs, cacti, tulips, mountains, valleys, canyons, rivers, oceans, streams. Everything that God has made will be redeemed. In the book of Revelation, John says he saw a new heaven and a new earth. And he heard a voice from heaven saying, behold, I make all things new. There at the very end of the Bible, you begin to get the feeling that everything, from the beginning until now has been moving toward that moment when God will use His divine freedom to make the world what He has always wanted it to be. A place where there will no longer be any death, where there will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. You get the feeling that God has made and kept all these promises to us as a way of moving us toward the biggest promise of all, that one day He will redeem all of creation. And Easter is the best evidence of that. Because if God can do this, if He can take the cold, pale, lifeless, bloody, broken, dead, and buried body of His beloved Son and breathe new life into it, then He can take the ruined and twisted wreck we have made of His creation and redeem it. God can make of it a new heaven and a new earth. So on Easter Sunday, we might go out onto Monument Avenue and say to people, listen, we've got good news. In the resurrection of Jesus, we have found a cure for death. But that's not the half of it. We believe that God is still at work and that He is getting ready to redeem all of creation, that one of these days, early in the morning, while it is still dark, He is going to get up and roll up His sleeves and make a new heaven and a new earth. That God is going to give us one day not only the cure for cancer, not only the cure for death, but the cure for anything that would keep us from being everything He has always dreamed we could be. That's a promise. Thanks be to God.